have Sofie Beier here, and she's the graphic designer and a professor at the Royal Danish Academy, and she's also the head of the Center for Visibility Design. And today, she's giving us a talk about the typeface legibility and the low vision readers. Let's welcome.
Thank you. It's not shifting. Oh, there it is. Good. All right. So if you were to design one typeface that was to sort of get to all low vision readers and improve reading for everyone, then you would probably fail. And that's based on the information that we have today on this. The reason for that is that different diagnoses result in different challenges. For example, if you're low vision, maybe you struggle with blind spots in your visual field. That could be in the center of vision, or it could be in the periphery. Or you could have tunnel vision, which is kind of the opposite, which is that you only can see like very small areas, typically in the center of vision, and those areas would be clear in vision. You could also have double vision. You could have distorted vision. You could struggle with seeing higher spatial frequencies, which means that your vision would be very blurry this way, like you see it on the right. Or you could have issues with struggling seeing low contrast between foreground and background. So based on this, we need to consider what the specific issues are, what are the specific challenges that the low vision readers have. And in that context, we have carried out 2 experiments in our research lab, and I'm going to present those today. And we have tested it with 2 different patient groups. So the first one has to do with age-related macular degeneration, also known as AMD. This is an eye disease, the most sort of widespread eye disease among elderly people in the Western world. And it's also something that has been highly investigated, how we can sort of support this reader group, rather large reader group. So before we get into sort of understanding what are the specific deficits of this reader group, we need to understand how normal vision people read. And that is that is this mic not working? Is it sort of falling out? You can hear it, yeah? Okay. So in normal vision readers, they use the center of vision. This is where you have clear vision. This is sort of the main point of your focus. But while you're reading there, you also use the peripheral vision to sort of identify where to place the next fixation on the text. AMD patients, they suffer from sort of areas of vision where they can't see anything. And this especially often happens in the center of vision. So if you don't have any central vision, then you only have your peripheral vision to actually read, and that becomes quite complicated. What happens in the periphery is that we are highly affected by a phenomenon known as crowding. And crowding is this where the further into the periphery, the more difficult it becomes to identify an object. That is, objects in the periphery tend to sort of merge together and becomes difficult to see. And this is sort of a way to show that. So if you look at the cross over here to the left and try to identify the R on the right, then it's much easier to identify the R when it's in isolation than when it's flanked by other letters. But if we then do this, sort of separate the letters more from each other, then it becomes much easier to identify the R while it's flanked by other. It's still more difficult than when in isolation, but it helps. So knowing this is something that's important when you think about how to typeset for this reader group. And this was something that we were concerned of. But before we go into sort of to talk through our study, I'm going to go through 3 other experiments that have been run before us into similar issues. So the first one here is from 1996. So here the researchers, they took these 2 different typefaces, Time Roman, Courier Bold, and wanted to see which one was most legible for AMD patients. They used the MN Read acuity chart, which is a very popular chart in the medical world, where this is what you use to sort of diagnose low vision readers or low vision patients. It has 3 different measures. One is reading acuity, which is sort of the smallest font size where you can read most of the text, but you're really struggling. Another one is called critical print size. That is the smallest font size where you can still read with ease. And so you're not struggling, but you're all right. And then we have reading speed. That is sort of the average of all the paragraphs that you read okay. So what did they found? On reading accuracy, that was the smallest size where you struggle, and on critical print size. They found in both these cases for the AMD patients that Curia Bold was easier to recognize in smaller sizes. That means that you could read it in smaller sizes than you could Times New Roman or Times Roman. The next experiment from 2013, they actually tested the same two fonts and added two more to their experiment. And here also, they also used them in read chart. And like the previous experiment, they also showed here that Curia was significantly easier to read in the smaller sizes. You could read it in smaller sizes than Times Roman. The last experiment here is from 2018. Again, the researchers took Times Roman and Curia, this was a regular version, and some other fonts as well. And again, Curia was significantly easier to read in small sizes than Times Roman. So, okay, we have 3 experiments here, different experiments, basically finding the same results. So that was something that we were interested in looking further into in our experiment. Because what is it about Curia that makes it better than Times New Roman? Obviously, as type designers, we can see there are multiple different issues that differ between these two. And if we want to identify the actual factors or the features that can be transferred to other fonts, then we need to isolate those variables. The difference between spacing, difference in stroke modulation, and difference in how much horizontal space it takes up on the line. So to isolate these variables, we got permission to alter Times New Roman to meet these features of Curia. So on the top row, we have the modulation of Curia added to Times New Roman. Then we have the width of the letters, the mono width aspect of Curia added to Times New Roman. And then we have Times New Roman with more spacing between the letters. And our aim here was to compare these 3 new versions with Times New Roman and see which one actually performed the better. And by doing so, then we have that variable from Curia that could be transferred to other fonts. So we used the Rantner reading chart, which is a similar chart as the MN read chart and has the same measures. We tested 20 low vision AMD patients of older age. And what we found was that the 2 fonts that actually had more horizontal space, that was the ones with wider letters and the ones with extra added space between the letters, they were easier to read at small sizes for this particular patient group. So that means, those are the features of Curia that actually made them in the previous experiment easier to read for this patient group. And it kind of makes sense. So if we look back at the effect of crowding, that by taking sort of the parts of the letters further apart, that means that we reduce the aspect of crowding within the letter. And obviously also by taking the letters, adding more space between the letters, we also reduce effect of crowding between letters. But there's also another sort of phenomenon that is interesting in this regard, and that is known as the cortical magnification factor. And that is the further into the visual periphery, then if you enlarge the object or the stimuli, then it becomes easier to see. And that is actually what we are doing. We enlarge it on the horizontal space, and therefore it's easier for everyone to see in the periphery, but specifically for this patient group because they need legible type in the peripheral vision. Okay, so this finding relates to AMD patients. But what about all the other patients? What, for example, about those with tunnel vision? So if we make the letters very wide, then maybe actually those with tunnel vision then can't see as many letters in their small visual field. So we can't just say, okay, so now we have this finding, let's make it for everyone. Because no, it's not necessarily right for everyone. We need to investigate that. The next experiment is with a patient group. Have a long name, we call them ADOA. They suffer from poor visual acuity and blurred vision. Similar things as the AMD patients, but not completely the same. So in this experiment, we were interested and we sort of observed that when you look at some non-profit low vision organizations, they have this, they try to often recommend ways of typesetting for their users. And sometimes they say you should use sans serif fonts, you should use serif fonts, they like that the first. But it seems like they're missing out on this very important aspects of the difference between sans serif and serif fonts, which has to do with the stroke contrast. That sans serif fonts generally have lower stroke contrast than serif fonts. So to investigate this effect on low vision people, how would the aspect of serifs being there or not being there, contrast, high contrast, low contrast, how would that interact with the reading for low vision readers? So for that purpose, we designed these 4 fonts. So here we have sans serif fonts, serif fonts, low stroke contrast, and high stroke contrast. So by having these 4 different fonts, we can isolate these 2 variables and see how they relate. We tested normal vision people, young normal vision people, and then we tested 19 low vision people with this specific diagnosis having a broader age range. The methodology was a lexical decision task. That is, so the task here is that you are shown a series of letters on the screen, and then you are to name whether it was a word or non-word. So this is a way of sort of testing whether we can actually read words, the relationship between the letters and the semantic understanding of that. Our measure was that we presented this in different sizes, so we'll be interested in to identify the smallest size where the participant could actually perform this task. So what were the results of this? When we looked at the normal vision readers and looked only at the sans serif fonts, then the low stroke contrast font was easier to read at small sizes. Serif fonts, the high stroke contrast was easier to read at smaller sizes. And in a way, this is like very good news, I think, because this follows convention within type design, meaning that when we design for normal vision readers, we can continue with what we're doing already. That's nice to know. But then when we move on to the low vision readers, that changed completely. So now the best font for this group, the font that was easiest for them to read in small sizes, that was the sans serif with high stroke contrast. And then when we go to the serif fonts, the same happened again. The font that was easiest to read for these low vision people had low stroke contrast. So normal vision, low vision. So this is kind of a problem, I think, especially sort of in the way where we think about this universal design, inclusive design, that when we design for the smaller groups, it also benefits the larger groups. But that's not true in this case. We can't design for both low vision people and normal vision people at the same time. So we were curious what was going on here. Why was it that the data was so clear in that opposite directions with these 2 groups? If you remember that these low vision people, they had blurred vision, that means that they have issues with seeing higher spatial frequencies. That is that the D here on the left is difficult for them to see. They see the world basically as the G on the right. And if we look at the whole spectrum of spatial frequencies, the low vision and normal vision people, when we always make use of the whole spectrum. There are situations where we use parts more than others, but in general, we use the whole spectrum when we read and when we see the world in general. So this patient group, they were forced to mainly use this part of the spectrum. So If we have a font where the power is actually at the lower end of the spectrum, then that could explain why that font was easier for the low vision people to read compared to normal vision readers. So with that thought, we visualized sort of the power of the spectrum as a function of cycles per image. And that is, so we have these peaks, and when we have the higher peaks, that means that there's a lot of data in the font for that specific area. And our low vision readers, their visual power is in the lower part on the x-axis. So looking into these, so where are the peaks on these graphs? You can see the first two peaks on the two fonts that performed well for the low vision readers. Those peaks are below the cycle per image of 10. When we look at the two graphs for the normal vision people, or the normal vision people performed well, here the two lowest ones, the second lowest one, is actually above the 10 degrees. So that means that the two fonts that normal vision people had easier reading with, that has a broader sort of distribution across the whole spectrum. So, this finding relates to people that have blurred vision. It probably also would help AMD patients and a lot of other patients, because a lot of people with low vision suffers from blurred vision. But what about those with poor contrast sensitivity? Or what about those with tunnel vision or distorted vision? That we don't know, so that needs testing as well. So what to do moving forward here? Low vision readers, they have different challenges. So depending on the diagnosis, there are different sort of combinations of issues that they struggle with. And also, low vision readers, they have different levels of severity. You're just not either low vision or not. This is a gradual process that you don't necessarily have the same issues all the way through your life. And also, what about the outliers? In all experiments, this also goes for when we look into normal vision people. We always have people that do not perform as a majority. So we look at the data and then we say, okay, we have significant findings here because we're looking at what the majorities are doing. But what about those that do not do that? So moving forward, I would argue that we need to think way more about personalizing the font for the individual reader. We need to think about how to create digital devices that can actually adjust to the needs of the individual instead of always designed for the majority. So, if you're interested in knowing more about this, this is my recent book, Type Tricks User Design, where I go through different sort of user groups and how science, the knowledge we have from science already available to us, how that can inform our way of deciding for the different readers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was beautiful. And we still have a little time for the Q&A. Is there any questions so that I can pass the microphone to you?
Hi, thank you for the talk. I was thinking now from a point of view from distribution, do you think that would help if there would have some place that would almost function like a foundry, which is almost like a pharmacy, where patients can go and instead of seeing typefaces that are serif typefaces, sans serif typefaces, they find a compilation of typefaces specialized for each one of their conditions. Because whenever we go to the doctor, we get a condition, we get very specific data on what are our conditions. But then we don't have anywhere where to get those, in this case, the pills, it would be typefaces, because you would need to know, in terms of communication, what you're looking at and what you're seeking.
Yeah, I think that definitely it is an issue that we both we don't necessarily know what the reader is struggling with, and we don't know how to help that. So yeah, I think we need more research on this, and we also need to formalize it more and be aware that this is actually an issue for this reader group. It's not that easy.
Yes, we need the typography doctors. Yes, I think we have no more time here, so I think thank you very much, Sofie.
Thank you.